Okay, and our next speaker is Tom Bianchi, and he's going to be talking on carbon remineralization and burial in the coastal margin, linkages in the Anthropocene.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's always fun to be here at OCB. So I'll be talking to you about different areas of the world in terms of these coast and margin interactions in the Anthropocene. Let's see. And I'd like to first begin with just acknowledging some of the funding and a number of key players. Many graduate students and postdocs that have come through the lab, and I'll be talking about their data. So just to give you a brief outline, I'll talk a little bit about these hotspots where we see carbon being buried in the coastal margin, how some of that's been impacted by a variety of different things within the aquatic continuum that changes these hotspots and hot moments in terms of interfering with the general pathway of flow. And then the last topic is a little bit sort of a new twist that I've been interested in, and has to do with the tropicalization and the movement of organisms across the planet from warming and what that might mean with respect to biogeochemistry and carbon preservation. So the hotspots, just a brief primer, basically about 86% of most of the organic carbon in the coastal ocean is buried in the coastal ocean. And the reasons for this are generally been worked out pretty well in the literature. There's high sedimentation rates, there's redox changes as a result of that high sedimentation rate, lower oxygen, mineralogical aspects that I'll talk about a little bit later, selective preservation based on the chemical composition of the organic matter, geopolymerization. This is sort of abiotic. This is not just made from the biological machinery of what goes into making the various compounds in a particular organic matter source, but these are happening outside of the cell where you can get linkages of different types of molecules that also can be quite recalcitrant. And then another topic that keeps getting more attention is sort of the role of iron. Iron is really, really important in a lot of the coastal margin being fed by the continents. So redox, again, many of you know, you can just look at sort of the gradient that you see here from oxic to hypoxic and anoxic systems that follow basically delta G in terms of their order of preference as you move down through the sediments thermodynamically. But there's other aspects, and so as I mentioned before, there's a new paper Hemingway and others just published showing sort of this selective preservation and mineral preservation, these two pathways where you start with a variety of different molecules and selectively you wind up with the ones essentially over on this side that are more recalcitrant, with the light open circles being perhaps the more labile and getting burned off. With the mineral story, you actually start, let's say, with the same recalcitrant labile compounds and you bring in mineral structures, and what happens is you get a broader array of different types of molecules that get preserved. So you can actually preserve some of these labile components. So both of these processes are going on, selective as well as this mineralogical aggregate kind of preservation enhancement. Some of the hotspots that we see, I'll be talking about from the aquatic continuum out, and some of the interferences that humans have had up basically in the watershed. And I'll talk about some of these other systems from fjords, blue carbon systems, seagrasses, mangroves, marshes that are very, very high carbon sequestration systems, high burial because of the close contact with low oxygen conditions. Of course, upwelling systems have all been very, very high preservation rates as well, related to high productivity, and again, that redox factor. In addition to the fjords, I'll also talk a little bit about what's happening in the Arctic as we start to thaw this permafrost, or this yedema material, which we call yedema, which is this very old carbon that's been stored under ice, that's very labile, and how that fits. So another recent paper that I was intrigued by that came out is sort of asking, well, we see all this information about the coastal ocean. What about the broader aspect of the larger aerial extent of the ocean? Has that been ignored? I don't think it's been ignored, but I just think it's a very, very different topic than what is more relevant with respect to sort of CO2 uptake. But this interesting paper I would encourage you to read that looks at basically depths that go down to 25 meters, covering 24 million years. You take these deep ocean sediments that are only less than 0.1%, and basically it adds up to a pretty big number, and sort of they're arguing that this is something that's been ignored. I think it's interesting. I think it's different than the coastal carbon story, and I just want to mention that, of course, when you think of the area of the planet and you think of the storage, as low as those carbon numbers are in the deep sea sediments, if you go down deep enough, you'll find quite a bit of carbon that's accumulated, but over very, very long time periods. So, and again, this also is an interesting paper that brings in the idea of mineralogical importance, because these are very oxygenated sediments, and this carbon's been protected by minerals. So that was just sort of a qualifier as it relates to the sort of larger expanse of the ocean. I'm going to take you on a little tour around the Arctic, some of these Alaskan fjords, some deltaic regions, Yangtze, Mississippi. The Scottish fjords I'll just mention very quickly. I won't have data to show, but it'll fit in with some of the other work that I will show you from some of the New Zealand fjords. So if we start off with a deltaic system, one of the hot spots for burial, the Mississippi, you can see here, Southwest Pass. This is the Mississippi Canyon. And this work basically looks at lignin, which is a molecule for terrestrial organic matter, going from the river out to the canyon. This is a busy slide. Just look at the two arrows. One is essentially showing that lignin's decreasing as you go out offshore. So lignin and the moieties of lignin are being decomposed, lignin phenols, not the pure lignin molecule that you find in plants, but various components of it. And we have this other indicator that shows that lignin's actually being degraded. So this shows you that as you move from these nearshore sediments, you can take terrestrial organic matter, and even though it's recalcitrant, it can be degraded. A lot of this is associated with minerals, but still degraded. We've been working with Pat Hatcher also, and we're finding that some of the decrease is not just related to the loss of lignin, but the fact that lignin falls outside of the analytical window and becomes something else, what we call CRAM, this carboxylic-rich alicyclic molecules that Pat and others have been arguing for as an important decay product that accumulates in the ocean. Carbon cycling in some of the other deltaic regions we've been working in, if you look off the Yangtze and the Yellow River, these are two big rivers that deliver lots of sediments. You have all of these different types of regimes of fluid muds, mobile muds. And when we start looking at areas up near the Yellow River and down by the Yangtze River, we see very, very differences in the amount of carbon decomposed in these systems. And again, I don't have time to show you this, but a lot of this has to do with the type of iron that actually is associated. There's different ferric hydroxides, hematite, goethite, all of these various iron minerals that can kind of sorb, or in the case of ferrihydrite, actually precipitate as you have iron 2 coming up, getting oxidized, it traps organic matter. Some of it may come from soils where goethite and hematite have been formed and it's just sorbed on. So iron can precipitate and trap organic carbon, or it can be sorbed on previously before entering the aquatic system. But you see these different types of differences in the rate of preservation that we find. We find that of all the carbon in these systems, about 20% of it is bound by iron. If you look at this slide, which is Delc-13 and radiocarbon, and some of these sort of end-member boxes, this is soil. One of the interesting things we see from a variety of samples around the globe is that these Arctic sediments have very, very old ages, as I mentioned before, and a lot of this is from this pre-aged carbon that's being released that's still very labile. As I said, it was sort of flash frozen and has been stored, and so it's very different than old carbon in the traditional way that we look at old carbon, that most of the goodies have been taken out. In the Arctic, you can release very, very old stuff, and it can be taken up very quickly. And it gets into the food web. You can find ducks up there that are 8,000 years old, radiocarbon-wise. So if you look at the ramp pyrolysis oxidation, or as Valier-Galli likes to call it, the dirt burner, it basically burns dirt and sediments, and you basically can have CO2 that's burned off. That's on that axis. On this axis, we have age. And if you can see at different temperatures, the idea is that the sooner the CO2 comes off, the more labile the compound and the younger the age. Okay, that's a sort of a bulk measurement just in characterizing age and how the rates of this burn off, this ramped pyrolysis that goes on. So the idea here is that we've looked at sediments in the Colville River. Here's the Colville Delta. This is the Killick station. So we have one at the Delta, one here I'm just making reference to. And basically they look very similar in age, very similar in their patterns. This one is from deeper sediments up in the upper basin, and this is actually out right on the Delta, Colville Delta. So the reason we think a good deal of this is from bank erosion. As you have these banks eroding, permafrost gets contributed into this and makes its way very quickly to the coast. This is very different than what's happening with DOC. A lot of the DOC is very labile that comes out from permafrost. A lot of it doesn't make it from the rivers to the coast because it's burned off. This is showing when things really, really start to get ugly as ice starts to melt, flow increases. You have a short period of time, the rates go up, and you can have big, big inputs of this permafrost material being delivered to the coast. Okay, so if you go up into the watershed, many of you know the dams have been creating havoc with deltas in particular. You can see the existing dams, and then you can see dams under construction. So we were a big player in this early on and no longer are. Other places, the Chinese, Indian, certainly Brazil, India, and so on, have been bigger players in more recent years. So this again has, as I said, wreaked havoc. If you look at a lot of these deltaic regions, all of this area here is where you're not getting enough sediment for the delta to keep up with sea level rise. So what does this have to do with carbon? Well, one of the things that you get as you build these dams is you create reservoirs that grow large amounts of algae. And so we started to look at the possibility of priming. Priming is the idea that you can take this very labile algal DOC and prime this more terrestrial DOC. That is, you can increase the rate at which that is burned off in the presence of algae versus when there's no algae present. And we've done a number of experiments with labeled materials, C13 labeled materials, and we definitely have proven that priming is important in a variety of these different systems that we see around the globe. This is an example of these kinds of really steep interfaces where you have green and brown water here, confluences, river plumes, and so on. To go to the dams, beyond the dams, but now to the delta, and beyond the delta, we start looking at some of these other systems. So we know that the deltaic systems are very, very hot spots for accumulating carbon, and fjords have been sort of largely ignored, but if you look sort of on an area normalized basis, well, if you basically just look at just total carbon buried in oceanic sediments across here, you can see the fjords are not, they don't stand out very much, but as soon as you incorporate area, you can see that the fjords actually, and we estimate about 11 to 12% of all of the oceanic burial goes into these fjords because they're steep and they have very, very anoxic bottoms, and not in all cases, but in many cases. Another area where we've worked, where we bring in now sort of the role of glacial systems, we've worked up in Alaska, and if you look at the glaciated systems, this is organic carbon accumulation rate. These are just various locations, but the main thing is these two areas here. We see much, much higher amounts of burial in these areas that are glaciated because the glaciers are actually pushing lots of petrogenic material out into the sediments compared to sort of non-glacial systems. So I was thinking about this, and we were working down in New Zealand where you find some of these relic systems that were formed. This is supposed to be CA, where during deglaciation you have these relic deltas, okay? And we wanted to look at how that compares with areas where you have, this is what the normal gradient looks like as you come to into Fjordland. Very, very steep. You can have lots of rapid input, very, very high burial. Well, if you look at material that's coming through Gare Arm and basically the Camelot River that feeds here, we find much, much higher decay of organic matter. So this is serving as sort of a platform for organic matter to sit as opposed to this more rapid injection. And it's very, very different than the rest of Fjordland. So what does that have to do with now? Well, basically we have glaciers that are starting to retreat. As they start to retreat, you start to get these deltaic systems that start to form. And this is something where we're actually starting to look at residence time and also potentially the delivery of iron and what iron can do as these glaciers start to retreat and put different rates of material, whether it's petrogenic or whether it's influencing the local phytoplankton. Okay, so you get down to carbon burial in an embryonic delta. So we go back to the deltas for a moment. This is a delta, one of the few areas in Louisiana that's actually gaining ground. Most of it is losing land mass. Basically, this is Wax Lake Delta. This was formed, again, by humans to provide flood relief for the Atchafalaya and started building this delta. So we've been looking at deltas that are thousands of years old, kinds of sedimentary systems. This is an embryonic delta where we can actually start to look at, on a scale of 38 to 13 years, what carbon burial looks like across this, and you can see the different types of habitats across here. And then you can see the types of carbon accumulation. So these, as it relates to elevation, right? So again, these are the newer areas, much lower, and then, of course, the older areas more established as you start to accumulate different types of blue carbon. We found that about 15% of the organic carbon was bound in iron, similar to what I was talking about with the Chinese deltaic systems. And so this changes as you start to move from these different chronological paces across these deltas. And we actually looked at how carbon and particular components of carbon are bound to iron, such as lignin, not just bulk iron, but lignin has some very interesting interactions in how it gets bound. So the final story here is sort of looking at these aquatic critical zones, which of course that term was coined in the terrestrial community. But there are lots of interesting things that are going on. And I think what needs to happen more, and of course it is happening now, is sort of the linkage between biogeochemistry and evolutionary biology. There are these really interesting gradients, these very steep gradients that we've created as a result of moving water around. A lot of the examples I just showed you, we create these interesting gradients. Some of them stay put, some of them actually change, some of them continue to change. How are the prokaryotes and metazoans actually adapting, moving to these systems? Well, if you look at the macrobenthic community as it relates more to carbon burial and sediments, when you take animal-sediment interaction courses, there are these classic paradigms in the types of organisms, where they prefer to be, what types of sediments, and so on. Well, we have a planet, if you look at the migration patterns of organisms on land and in the ocean, it looks like a highway map in terms of this tropicalization as organisms are moving poleward. And most of the emphasis is on biodiversity, so not too many people are thinking about what this means as you start changing the composition of macrobenthos in different regions, and how that affects redox and how that affects what's already stored in sediments. And Snellgrove looked at some of this as it relates to other studies. He did some global estimates of sediment community oxygen, DIC, and biogeochemical turnover. And you can see his numbers pretty much fall in between some other studies. His emphasis in this paper was not so much on the migration, but just how these numbers vary globally with different types of benthic communities. And again, this is sort of looking at these different types of scenarios you can have with different types of feeders, whether they're deposit feeders, whether they're surface feeders, subsurface feeders, suspension feeders, and so on. And imagine these kinds of systems changing. I mean, this is sort of the usual scenario that you get in disturbed systems, going from very small polychaetes to deep burrowers. Now, think of all these different scenarios that I've just shown you, where humans are actually changing the mixing zone. They're changing the rate of deposition. They're changing the redox. How are these organisms adapting? We see in one particular scenario in Florida, the mangroves are actually moving up in Texas. In Florida, they're replacing the marshes. Most of the people that have worked on this have been interested in the plants. So I pose this question: what are the animals doing as you start to move? And so with the foundational plant species, now you're starting to see very deep burrowing mangrove crabs coming into areas that were previously marsh, and they're changing the redox tremendously. So this, we don't have the data on this, but we have very preliminary information that sort of relates what I'm talking about with movement, this tropicalization, and what that might mean with carbon storage. So final thoughts: more studies are needed with these sediment carbon dynamics and benthic mixing rates, and how that relates to evolutionary and phenotypic plasticity. When I say phenotypic plasticity, you can decide to move on or you can decide to stay. Some organisms may change genetically. Some organisms have the genetics already to develop different phenotypic features. The lobsters are moving north in the Scotian Shelf, and this is one of the areas where they've already found some very interesting genetic clines where the gradients are in temperature, where the organisms are moving, and the genetics of the organisms right along what we call these allozyme, or these genetic clines. Not just with lobsters, but also with some deep sea fish and so on. Ryan Stanley has published a paper in Science on that. Changes in Biota Bation, as that might relate to changes in redox and aggregate mixing rates. Again, all of this being altered by humans. Zones of deglaciation, maybe these are going to be different interactive zones, or what we call these critical zones that might change the residence time and processing and input of iron, and then just sort of generally how within the aquatic continuum, from dams, regional precipitation, nutrient fluxes, all of these various things that we typically think of as being very important in controlling organic carbon preservation as well as photochemical processing versus microbial. These are the kinds of things as we change these gradients of light and so on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. Excellent, perfect. So questions for Tom?
Hi, Will Barrelson, USC. Tom, great summary, but lacking the kind of quantification that I'd really like to see. How do we get a number? For example, I know not all mangroves are the same, not all marshes are the same, but is carbon burial in a mangrove system larger or smaller than carbon burial in a marsh system?
Yeah. Oh, we know that. Actually,
what's the number? Percent? How does it change?
I can't give you the percent. I can give you the percent. I can give you the numbers, but it varies. But most of the mangroves and marshes that we see in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, the mangroves are burying more. There's more woody material. The other benefit you get from mangroves is you get greater elevation for protection from storms. Now, that's fine from the human perspective. Of course, what does that mean in terms of fish populations and other things that mangroves are not giving the biological community that marshes were? So it's not all positive. But from a human standpoint, the mangroves are actually sequestering more and building up the coast in most cases, but I don't know what percent.
Thanks for the talk. I was curious, iron kept coming up, but I was curious more about the mechanisms, and you mentioned different types of iron, and so I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I went through that kind of quickly. As I was saying, there's usually sort of two mechanisms. One is the way you can bring iron up through iron 2 in the reduced zone, and as it precipitates out, it captures organic carbon with it when it makes the precipitate ferrihydrite, typically goethite. But then there are other times where you can actually just have material being sorbed, and it's not related to the precipitation. So it's coming in, and a lot of that is hematite formed in soils that makes its way down through the rivers. And then you get this selective distribution going on as you get to the coast based on how strong that iron organic carbon bond is in terms of how far they make it out and where they go on the coast.
Hi, I'm Andrea Fossbender from Mbari. I'm really interested in this idea of bioturbation, changing the redox chemistry and then releasing the labile carbon. You said that there's a long record of looking at the organic carbon going back millions of years. So is there any correlation with changes in benthic species with that?
No, that's a great, I just want to show you one thing. This is a paper we're working on with a variety of different people, geneticists, experts in benthic fauna, and so on. And we even have people that are actually have looked at historical changes in the types of macrofauna after big extinction events. Big extinction events, you get lots of different speciation, very rapid, because a lot of the predators that used to eat you have gone if you survived. So there are these big changes that they're looking at, and also other big changes that happen in the record where there might be changes in precipitation or might be changes in large inflows of sediments and so on, and how that fits with the, but it's restricted to the fossils, right? So you're restricted, you're not looking at the myofauna and some of these other components, microbial and so on. But certainly that's another thing we're actually bringing in is what can we learn from the past from big changes, the kinds of ones we're creating. I mean, we're essentially causing the same kind of movement of organisms or extinction of organisms through warming. And what can we learn from past pulsed periods where you see these changes? And there's some pretty good evidence for some paradigms with the types of ships you see with deep, shallow suspension deposit, Peter. But that's a good question. You sort of go back and look.
Thank you. For fjord systems, do you know anything about harmful algal blooms?
Pardon?
For fjord systems? For fjord systems?
Yeah.
Because they retain nutrients. They're like big bathtubs. Harmful algal blooms and the sediment interactions. Do you know anything about that?
Not so much on the nutrient side. It's been more, and I didn't mention anything about the Scotland, but the Scotland fjords collectively store more carbon than the peatlands in Scotland. This was totally shocking to everyone. In terms of nutrients, I can't say how much is going on with nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, but the people in Scotland are very, very interested in the role of fjords in sequestering CO2 and storing it. And it's like I said, it's a very big number since it exceeds the peatlands. But I can't say about particular nutrient retainment.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Tom one more time.